Hello and welcome to another TLDR US video. We recently took a little break from uploading, during which time we missed an incredibly important story. Now we're back though, we want to get right to it and address Georgia's voting rights bill. This bill fundamentally looks to change the way that voting works in the state and goes further than some might appreciate. It's also led to some controversial boycotts and some anger from Trump. So let's discuss what the bill does and the chaos surrounding it. Before we do though, as I said in the intro, we've just come off a few-week break and we're hoping to get right back to making new content for you. So if you want to support us and help our return, then be sure to subscribe, like, and comment below the kinds of stories you want to see us cover in the future. Thanks so much for your support. It might feel like a million years ago already, but we're not that long out of the 2020 election cycle. An election year that ended bitterly, to say the least. Before the results were even announced, Trump and his allies began spreading a narrative of corrupt elections, rigged voting, and dodgy mail-in ballots. He echoed this in his speech on election night, where he used the backdrop of the White House to continue his claims that the election had been stolen. Despite tense and ongoing lawsuits, passionate speeches, and iconic locations, Trump's team was never able to make any of these claims stick in court or anywhere else, and even justices that Trump nominated for their loyalty rejecting the case. This might upset some people, but as much as we try and stay as objective as possible, this is the absolute objective truth. These claims were never proven in a court of law or anywhere else, and many of them we've debunked on this channel. Anyway, with these claims of rigging in the air and Trump never really conceding, it's not all that surprising that the issue of voter rights and protecting the ballot continues to rumble on, with some Republican state legislators keen to stop the steal from happening again. One such state was also a major focus in the 2020 fraud claims: Georgia. Chances are that you've already heard at least a bit about Georgia's new piece of tinkering with election law, but many of you will have only heard the broad ideas about it. So let's take a moment to break it down and explain what's actually in the bill. The most famous, or perhaps infamous provision of the bill, and the detail you're probably most familiar with at this point, is the part that talks about giving food and water to voters. And by talks about, I mean bans. The distribution of any food or water within either 150 feet of a voting location or within 25 feet of any person standing in line with the passing of this bill will constitute a misdemeanor. But the bill's changes don't end there, because it's filled with little details. And while we can't cover all of them, there are a few big ones. One of those is a significant set of changes to DROPBOX rules. During the 2020 election, Atlanta's metro area had 94 drop boxes scattered around the 4 sprawling counties that make up its urban core. During the next election, it will have a maximum of 23. This is because election officials can now only establish one additional drop box per 100,000 active voters in a county, or one per early voting site, whichever would result in fewer drop-off locations. On top of that, all of these drop boxes will have to be inside government buildings or early voting locations, meaning that they can't be accessed when said building is closed. Early voting itself can only take place at its most expansive from 7 AM to 7 PM on weekdays and on periodic weekends. Keep in mind that 7 till 7 is the maximum. County officials get to implement such a time frame, with the minimum statewide default being 9 AM to 5 PM. Now, you could try and avoid these time restrictions by voting absentee, but there's now more restrictions there too. Whereas before you only needed a signature to vote absentee, you now also need a driver's license or equivalent. The time frame for these ballot applications has also been halved from about 6 months prior to the election to about 3. On top of all of this, it's now illegal for the state to send out absentee ballot applications to voters unsolicited, something that even Georgia's Republican officials did during the 2020 primaries. And remember, if you want to avoid the uncertainty of mailing your ballot in, you can only access a drop box during working hours inside early voting buildings. But perhaps the biggest move in this bill comes in the form of increased powers to the state legislature itself during the election process. For starters, the Secretary of State has now been booted out of the chairperson seat of the State Election Board. That position is now to be filled by someone appointed by the state legislature. Now, said nominee is theoretically supposed to be non-partisan, and there are provisions in place to help enforce that, like preventing members of the legislature from appointing themselves. But, having a partisan body appoint a non-partisan actor is always going to be at least a slightly questionable process. This serves a dual purpose of giving the General Assembly more power and giving the Secretary of State, who ruffled Republican feathers in 2020 by denying false claims about voter fraud, less power. Compounding this new burst of influence to the General Assembly is the provision of the bill that allows the State Election Board to suspend county election officials and replace them with a temporary appointment. Now, there are restraints on this process. The board can only suspend officials in 4 counties at one time, and in order to be suspended, an official has to clearly violated election board rules 3 times, or demonstrated nonfeasance, malfeasance, or gross negligence in administering 2 consecutive elections. But this still amounts to a significant increase in the legislature's control over elections on a county level. Something that has made people more than a tad uncomfortable. It might not surprise you to learn that that's not the only part of the bill that's not gone over particularly well with people. Voting rights activists have voiced concerns over most provisions in the bill, with many particularly worried about the effect that this bill will have on black turnout. Things like stricter ID requirements have historically had a disproportionate effect on minority voters, and in a state as competitive and diverse as Georgia, that could have a legitimate impact on the election results. Adding more regulations to early voting times and restricting DROPBOX access has also struck many as a way to discourage people from voting, especially those who can't easily get away from work to go to the polls during prescribed hours. And of course, stopping people from giving voters waiting in line bottles of water could have a disproportionate impact on urban voters, who often face longer lines. In response then, some began to pile pressure on big businesses to boycott the state in protest. One organisation that did was Major League Baseball, who pulled events from the state. Unsurprisingly, those in the GOP weren't thrilled by this, including the former president, who objected to the cancel culture unfolding before his eyes. In response, he encouraged people to boycott the MLB, as well as other Georgia businesses like Coca-Cola and Delta. These can be added to the long list of companies that Trump has encouraged supporters to boycott, including Goodyear Tires, Harley-Davidson, Apple, CNN, AT&T, Macy's, Rolling Stone, HBO, the entire nations of Mexico and Italy, Glenfiddich, and Oreos. So it seems that maybe his issue isn't with cancel culture as such, but more when a cancellation doesn't fit his other interests. Anyway, it seems that he's not the only one to take issue with this decision, with state Democrats like Stacey Abrams also questioning MLB's decision. Following the MLB's announcement, Abrams released a statement saying that while she respects boycotts, she didn't want to see Georgia families hurt by lost events and lost jobs. The MLB, after all, would have brought entertainment and extra economic stimulation to the state. It's hard to see this statement without thinking about the political lines that Abrams is being careful to tread, probably in anticipation of a potential run for governorship in 2022. In wording things the way she did, Abrams manages to support the idea of the boycott without angering Georgians who might be frustrated, whether or not they supported the bill at the loss of a major event in their state. Time will tell whether this boycott ends up working, and if sustained pressure on Georgia will change anything, or if it will deter other states from contemplating similar changes. Ultimately though, whether Republicans and Trump like these corporate interventions, they could prove powerful in years to come. While the Senate and other political institutions in the US grant additional powers to white rural voters, corporations generally lean towards the interests of younger and more metropolitan citizens, and could prove to be an interesting counterweight. How this ends up shaking out in Georgia, across the country, and how this impacts the Party of Business's relationship with corporations will be interesting to observe over the months to come. But it's clear to see why some are worried about the implications of this new bill. Let us know what you think of the bill and of the whole situation in the comments below. Also, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a video. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible, and if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that's in the description.